Good morning, everyone. My name is Joaquin Escobar, Chair of the State Board. Today is Tuesday, May 21st, and it is 9:31 a.m., and I would like to call this meeting to order. I'll begin by introducing my fellow board members and staff. To my left would be Vice Chair Diadamo, but she is going to be 15 minutes late. To her left is Board Member McGuire. To my right, Board Member Tam Doduk, and to her right, Board Member Laurel Firestone. And today, assisting us, we have Eric Oppenheimer, our Chief Deputy, and Michael Loffer, our Chief Counsel. Good morning. I'll quickly go through the emergency evacuation procedure. Please look around and identify the two exits closest to you. In the event of a fire alarm, we're required to gather up our valuables and evacuate to this room immediately, and we'll evacuate to Cesar Chavez Park, which is across the street, and there's a Starbucks on the other side, so you can grab some coffee. And again, I really hope that Starbucks is giving us, no, they're not giving us anything. I'm sorry, I shouldn't even say that. Please obey all traffic signals and be careful when crossing the street. I also want to let you know this meeting is being webcast and recorded, so please speak into the microphone clearly when you come up. And most importantly, please turn off your cell phones. My script used to say beepers, but if you have beepers, turn those off too. Basically anything that makes noise. So first item is we have public forum, and that's if we have anyone wishing to address the board on an item that is not currently on our agenda. Thank you. And we have Sue Garner looking to discuss the underground storage tank reimbursement fund.
Hi.
Hello, good morning.
Chair Esquivel and members of the board, thank you. I've been here before to testify on my experience of working with the UST Reimbursement Fund. And I guess I would first just start out saying that there has been some improvement, under the new management, which has been awesome. I think that, first I'd just like to address the fact that I think that it feels like working with the fund is always starts out with a attitude of guilty until proven innocent. So when reimbursements are submitted, it seems that the approach is ineligibility versus eligibility. So is the amount that's being requested, why is it eligible versus, why is it ineligible versus why is it eligible? So it creates this dynamic of, I'm going to use the word hostility, but I think that's or tension. Let me use the word tension, between consultants and claimants and the fund. And although I'm on the stakeholders committee, and I appreciate being on that committee, I just think that there's more that can be done, to improve the relationship between claimants and consultants and fund staff. Secondly, during the early 2000s, the fund was operating under a cash crisis, which ended up triggering an audit in early 2009. And the audit identified a number of items to try and streamline the efficiency within the fund and address, the issues that were leading to having depleted funds. And I think a lot of the processes that we see today in the fund are directly probably related to, that audit in 2010. And it seems like it's been a pendulum. So initially there was no money, and now there's a lot of money, a surplus of funds. And I think it's around 900 million, and it may even be more. So now there's a surplus, and how do we get that money out to claimants? And how do we? The other thing is that legislation requires that there's a 60-day process between when a reimbursement request is submitted and when the money actually gets to the claimant, although there was a little bit of a gap there in terms of, the funds process and then it going to accounting. There was a delay there. I think that could even take up to 2 weeks. And so my understanding of how the fund is working today, because of fiscal, which we all know has been a problem and causing delays, that the fund is operating normally, except that it goes to accounting or there's been some issues, and which is delaying payment. So I have one site for Santa Barbara High School that's been in the hopper. Actually, let me start with another site. I have a couple of letters to show you. Claim 19219 for Santa Barbara Metropolitan District, which was submitted in November of 2018, and that went to accounting on May 3rd. And then I have so that is clearly way over the 60-day requirement that the fund currently has. I understand that there's been fiscal issues, but just in terms of the fund's responsibility in getting the money to the claimant, there's been a big delay. In this particular claim, the claimant, which is the Metropolitan District, they provide bus service to Santa Barbara County, and the claimant wrote a letter that was submitted with a reimbursement request. They were applying for over $700,000, and they have a $525,000 budget deficit, which potentially affects bus service. And that letter was submitted with the reimbursement request. And I understood that the fund was going to do everything they could to try and get the money back to the claimant to bridge that gap. And I was told this week that the fund had other information, which they didn't provide to me, where the applicant no longer needed that money. I checked in with the applicant, and I was told that wasn't the case. So I have the letter here. I think the concern that I would like to address is that I have two sites. One is claim 19212, and the other is for Santa Barbara High School, 18782. And in both cases, I have letters that have been submitted by the claimant or a supplier for the claimant. And I've been told in both cases that there's some disbelief over written communication from claimants and suppliers to claimants. And I find it alarming that the fund essentially doesn't believe written communication that is signed by leaders of these companies. And in fact, for Santa Barbara, which happens to be a fund director appeal at this time, that current supplier has written 2 letters to the fund, and they've received awards from the California legislature and the state of California Senate. So these are not contractors who have poor reputations in their communities. And I can leave both of those letters, over here so that you can get copies of those. And so with the next audit that's coming up, I'm just hoping that, some of these issues of mistrust and that written communication that comes from claimants as well as suppliers will be given some weight in terms of analysis of reimbursement requests. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate you coming up. Yes, by all means, Board Member Dodek.
Just very quickly, thank you for bringing up those issues.
Thank you.
The fund has been an area that I have had a great deal of interest in, especially when we went through that rough period in the early 2000s. And there's been a lot of changes made. There's a lot of processes that have been developed to streamline the process. And I think staff has made an incredible progress in terms of shortening the response time, but obviously there are always going to be checks and balances in any streamlining effort. So I don't believe it is the staff's intention to create an atmosphere of distrust, but it is their intention, as directed by us and the law, to fully ensure that these reimbursements are appropriate, that there are no inconsistencies between what is submitted as well as what has been done. So I appreciate you raising the concern. I mean, I can't speak to the specifics of the two cases you mentioned. We certainly will hear from staff at a later time on that, as I'm sure they'll look into it. But I will just say right now, I can reassure you that based on my interaction with staff on this issue, on the fund, over the course of over 10 years, their professionalism and their commitment to ensure that the claims are processed as efficiently as possible, but also as appropriately as possible is something that is paramount. So I'll just toss that out there.
Thank you. No, I agree. And I started my testimony by saying that I've noticed improvements. Absolutely. I think, I guess, my two concerns that I would like to leave you with is just this pendulum in terms of the fund not having enough money to this,
I understand that,
yeah.
but whether or not the fund has money, the requirements to process those claims in an appropriate, straightforward, solid manner is still valid.
I agree.
And I think ultimately the pendulum swing that you're seeing in the fund now not getting the dollars out quickly enough is more tied to the fiscal issues. So, there are two issues here. One is your concern about the relationship amongst, the stakeholders and those within the program and the feeling of mistrust. That, is a legacy of the fraud and abuse that was happening within the fund.
Right.
And we needed to make sure it was addressed. But we did do a tremendous amount of streamlining, I know, and although I've only been here on the board for 2 years, know that part of that success story has been the improvements in the fund, to your acknowledgement, in getting the dollars out. Right now, we are in a very challenging point with fiscal. We've been very honest and open about that, and in this board meetings, it's part of our executive director report, an ongoing sort of assessment of where we are as we're trying to, like many agencies in the state, really get our arms around fiscal, and it's been difficult. And so, we appreciate your patience in some of that, but also we're looking to make sure as board members that those friction points with fiscal, that's, it's terrible to see, such improvement happen in the UST fund, and then see it all just kind of evaporate because of this other challenge that we have with the fiscal system. And so we appreciate you coming. This is why we have our public forum, to be able to flag these things, although it's not on our agenda. And, we'll definitely follow up specifically on your cases. Staff will, and then, but more generally to your points about the relationship, we can continue to talk about that.
Right. And I appreciate you looking at these two cases because one of them may end up in front of you.
Okay.
So, okay, thank you very much.
Much appreciated.
Yeah.
Any other public comment? No. Thank you, Janine. With that, we'll now move on to consideration of the last board meeting's minutes. It was from the May 6th, 7th board meeting, and I'll entertain a motion.
I actually have not had a chance to get back to the board, but I do have two minor clarification, really, with respect to my report, under board member report. On the second bullet, the clarification here should be that I asked staff to look into how the cost of compliance analysis was conducted in the Dairy Representative Monitoring Program. So we could make that clarification. And in the third bullet, it was really my intent to request that the Central Valley Regional Board staff provide me with a briefing on their effort to address the E. coli issues on the American River, and to the extent that that integrates with the homelessness situation there. So it was not a direction for staff to pull together a collaboration, but really just a request for a briefing. Thank you. And with that, those change, unless there are any other changes, I'll move for adoption of the minutes.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Carries, and the meeting minutes are passed. Okay, we'll move on to uncontested items. That's items 2 through 5. We do have time, so if any board members have any comments they want to make on these items, knowing that, one, thank you for staff and all their time and work on these, but we can approve them in block unless anyone has any comments. Great. Do I have a motion for uncontested items 2 through 5?
Move adoption of the uncontested items 2 through 5. I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Great. Items 3 to 5 are passed. And thank you to staff for all of your great work on it. Our hearing of them does not reflect on our thanks for that work. Next, we'll move on to our informational items. And the first item we have up is our quarterly Delta Stewardship Council Lead Scientist Report. And today we have Dr. John Calloway. And joining him is our Delta Water Master, Mr. Michael George.
I think I'm becoming surplus to this quarterly report. I was the official handholder, but Dr. Calloway doesn't need any handholding, so John, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate the support and the connection between the board and the Stewardship Council. So thank you, Chair Esquivel and board members, for the chance to present to you about Delta Science. I have a few things that I want to talk about to you today. One is the Biological Goals Advisory Panel report that just came out last month. Results from the solicitation, the call for proposals, and the review of proposals for research funding that's been going on over the last 6 months. A few other items, and then a recent paper that was in San Francisco Estuary Watershed Science by Bruce Herbold and colleagues on salmon resiliency in the face of climate change. So let's see, I need the clicker. So to talk about the Biological Goals Advisory Panel, this was a panel that staff from the board requested from the science program, the Delta Science program, to put together an advisory panel to give input on the development of biological goals for the update to the Bay Delta Plan. And this is a typical role that the science program plays, both for the board as well as for other agencies. We frequently put together review panels that look at a published document or a particular issue, and the review panel provides input on the scientific issues around that particular document. Advisory panels we do less frequently, but we've done multiple times in the past, and in that case it's more planning, giving input, not on policy issues, but on the science behind these issues and what kinds of science should be considered in setting policy. So this advisory panel was looking at the biological goals. They were asked specifically by staff to look at 3 issues related to the biological goals: salmonids, they were asked to look at other native fish, and then ecosystem processes. They started their work at the end of last year. They had a draft and a public meeting in March that some of you attended, I think, and also got input from a number of stakeholders, and then they finished their final report just last month in April. And I would say the panel, there were 6 panel members. Cliff Dahm, who was the former lead scientist, was the chair, and it really was a stellar group of scientists, 2 scientists who had real strong salmon focus, 2 with native fish, and 2 looking at ecosystem processes. I think they gave some very valuable input that I'll go over in just a second. But I think in terms of thinking about these kinds of panels, what made it successful was a really a strong panel, a really committed panel that put a lot of effort into this, a lot of commitment from your staff. So I want to acknowledge Diane Riddle, Aaron Forsman, and Matt Holland, who really helped to give input on the charge to our staff, and really gave a lot of input throughout the process that made for an effective report. And then also on our side, Rachel Klopfenstein put an enormous effort to lead the panel through their work. So in looking at their results, as I said, they were asked not to give specific recommendations on exact goals, but on the approach to developing goals and the science behind the goals. So in looking at salmonids, they were asked specifically to look at a previous report that came out on the Stanislaus River using viable salmon population approach, and they were asked, is that an appropriate method, and could that be used on other tributaries and within the Delta to understand salmon population dynamics and set goals. And they felt that it is definitely a valuable approach. They focused on salmon abundance and salmon productivity, and they looked at using stock recruitment approaches, understanding the adult population, the relationship of the adult population to the outgoing juvenile population, and what is driving that relationship as a key way to understand dynamics within the population. They highlighted that the goals, rather than look at a simple goal like doubling the population, they focused on growing the population. So just growing the abundance of the population over time. And
maybe you just need a really good fish dating app to help them.
Yes,
a fish dating app to just help them.
Fish dating app would do well, yeah. They need all the help they can get. So, this growing the population is clearly the focus. And they highlighted if you have a population that is growing over time, and you really need to look at this not just year to year, but over a longer period, 5-year to 10-year periods. So they highlighted the value of long-term monitoring data to understand this. They also highlighted the importance of understanding the last bullet point there, the importance of understanding wild populations versus hatchery populations. And really the challenge currently is that there is not very good data in separating those. And the goal really is around the wild populations, but being able to manage them. So they were really encouraged. Some of their recommendations were to look at ways that we could get better data on wild runs versus hatchery runs, and also better data on individual tributaries. So there's better data in terms of salmon population dynamics and life history than on many of the other components of the ecosystem, but really not good, a need for better data in some of the tribs, and looking at separating that wild and hatchery population.
On that issue, other than tagging all the hatchery fish, do they come up with other suggestions as to how to better monitor?
So clipping the tags is, I think,
yes,
for all fish is their recommendation, so that you could really clearly distinguish wild and hatchery fish. Okay, so on other fish, notice that it doesn't say other native fish. So one of their specific recommendations was consider all the fish in the ecosystem. And given that some of our target native species, like the Delta smelt in particular, the population is so small now that the data, it's hard to understand whether dynamics in the population are due to particular forcing factors or just random variations in the population. So they highlight that we should consider both native and non-native species, like the striped bass, that may be a surrogate has many of the same habitat characteristics as some of our native fish. Also look at non-native fish in a negative sense of growing populations of predatory fish that are causing problems, is something to be concerned about. But so they identified we should be looking at that broad range. Again, they highlighted the importance of existing monitoring data. There is less data available for our native fish in terms of population dynamics, so we can't do the kinds of population recruitment analysis for other individual native species, but we do have very good data on abundance and distribution from the work that the IEP and others have been doing across the Delta. Not as much information up into the trib, so I think we probably do need to grow that data up into the tributaries. And then they identified, rather than looking at individual species, look at species groups. And they had some specific recommendations about different kinds of fish communities that that could be useful. So they had 6 different communities that they identified would give us an understanding of a range of the different needs across the fish communities within the estuary and the tributaries.
Do you feel those 6 groups are pretty comprehensive and reflective of what we would need to kind of focus down in on, or?
Yeah, I think they are very comprehensive, and I think one thing that they put together in the report that was very useful is for all of the, and this is across all of the existing monitoring efforts that are occurring, what species are being caught within which individual surveys, and it shows, by focusing in on those particular species, you get a broad distribution across all of them. And I think we do have pretty good coverage across those. So they do highlight the need for some additional monitoring in that regard, especially up in the tribs. But I think within the Delta, I think we have pretty good data there. So then the last area that they were asked to look at was on these ecosystem processes or ecosystem function and structure. And so the idea of ecosystem function are the dynamics or the changes that are occurring within the ecosystem, whereas the structure is sort of the current condition, just what the characteristics, the standing characteristics of the ecosystem. And in terms of structure, you could think about things like what plant species are there, what's the temperature, the physical conditions, as well as the chemical conditions of the ecosystem. In terms of function, we're talking about things like productivity, plant growth, nutrient dynamics, turnover of nutrients, food web support, and those kinds of issues. So they encourage looking at both of those issues of structure and function. In terms of looking at these, there definitely is much less data available than for the fish-focused efforts. And beyond looking at physical and chemical properties of the ecosystem, they also stress the need to look at productivity. So since the primary productivity, whether that's productivity in the channels of plankton or on the margins in terms of marshes and riparian areas, that plant growth, whether it's algal or plant or otherwise, is what's driving the food web. And in many cases, a challenge for our fish communities is the lack of available food resources. So thinking about how do we get a better understanding of productivity, and then as we do more restoration, see are we really making large-scale changes in overall productivity, and then secondary productivity, the organisms that are eating all that, whether it's the zooplankton or the organisms in the mud, that are providing the food resources for the fish and the birds and the other high-level animals within the system. And as is indicated there in terms of productivity, they mentioned looking both at the pelagic, the water column, what's happening with the plankton, which actually in the delta and the estuary, we have much better information on that and much less information on productivity in the marshes and in that component. So those are all the key points I wanted to highlight. Any additional questions on the biological goals?
I was just going to ask, are there examples of other states that are undertaking similar work around development of biological goals for various watersheds, or trying to move away from sort of single species or species sort of, and kind of do this sort of work in other places where it's successfully being done at this point as well, or just trying to get a sense of where we are, I guess, relative to other folks as we kind of embark on this discussion?
That's a good question. So I think one thing is there are other efforts. I would say everyone acknowledges it's not a simple thing. So I would say this is really, we were talking with your staff yesterday about sort of the summary and the feedback in terms of what worked for the panel and how we can improve on future panels. And one thing we all acknowledged was this isn't the answer. This is a step towards developing the goals and an initial step. And other systems are making similar efforts, but there isn't like a simple answer to this. But I would say in the report, they highlight work being done in Florida on the Kissimmee River above the Everglades, restoration on the Kissimmee River, and then they highlight work in Australia as well that Cliff Daum was involved with on some of the watershed focus in there. But on other big systems, whether it's riverine systems like the Missouri River has a big effort currently going on to look at restoration and dynamics there with a focus beyond just single species. I've done work in Louisiana. In Louisiana, there's a lot of work now currently going on evaluating their restoration projects. I think the challenge here is the mix of dynamics. It's, water quality, water flow, restoration, all of those issues make for understanding the driving forces is more challenging.
Yeah, every watershed being unique unto themselves, means, and we have our own peculiar mix of challenges when we talk about this watershed that's 40% of the state. So, but I really appreciate the work. I know it's extremely critical to our discussions, even around voluntary agreements and the plan of the water quality control plan update, obviously, because it was in that context that we requested the report from you. But I was really glad to see it, and I think it's going to be really helpful, as you said, as a first sort of context setting, our first kind of take of how can we start to synthesize these biological goals, which are going to be really, I think, critical for us to move away from the dynamics we currently find ourselves with single species focuses that don't actually improve the watershed-wide sort of ecosystem that we're really trying to look at.
In the report where they outline the distinction between areas where quite a lot of information already exists, for example, in the estuary, as opposed to the tributaries. Could you make a overly simplified comment on this regarding is the lack of information? Do we just need more funding in order to obtain the information, or is there something about the areas in the watershed in which we don't have as robust information as, say, in the estuary, where it's just more challenging to gather that information?
I would say it's definitely there isn't easy funding available, so that certainly contributes to it. But I think the bigger issue is the scale. So there has been so much focus in on the Delta, and now as we expand the scale, moving the monitoring up into those other areas and collecting with the intensity that we have in some of the existing areas is just a huge challenge. There's the area that's encompassed is so much larger, and so I think what we really need to do is think about, okay, if we're going to set these goals now, what are the priorities in terms of monitoring so that we can't collect everything, but I think then the next step, obviously, setting the goals is most critical for anything, having clear objectives, but then linking the monitoring to those goals so that we're sure we're collecting the right kind of information so that we can understand the signal, understand the change that we're hoping to see as we start to make some management improvements.
Right. And then the second question has to do with the conversation regarding, let's see here, focus on maintaining growing populations rather than a simple goal of doubling. And I happened to be here when the panel talked about this, which I found fascinating, because I've always viewed the doubling goal as more of a policy goal as opposed to something that is attainable based on science. And so I found the dialogue interesting and have not yet had an opportunity. I talked with staff earlier today about this issue, so I look forward to the opportunity to reading the report, but not having a background in science, I don't know that I would be able to distinguish sort of that fine line between policy as opposed to science. So could you comment or provide any comment that would help us as we read through the report regarding that growing populations rather than the simple goal of doubling?
So I think it really gets to just what you were saying in terms of there isn't the science to support the idea that doubling the population is the best, is really the goal that we should be achieving. If we get to that, we're done. And if we don't get to it, we failed. But there is strong evidence, of course, that we want to keep the populations moving in the right direction. So I think what they were pushing towards was that in terms of the science, there isn't clear evidence that is better than tripling the population or increasing the population by 50%. And so rather than having that, so I think, as you said, an aspirational goal of doubling the population is probably valuable, but in terms of evaluating if we're making progress, making sure that we're moving in the right direction is what we should be doing, and hopefully we keep making progress towards that doubling goal or better.
That helps. Thank you.
Good.
Hi, I have a question. So thank you very much. This is a helpful report, and thank you for all the work that the panel put into this. So
Yes.
you mentioned briefly the non-native species and the striped bass and possible negative implications that they may be having. So was there a goal or discussion of other predatory species or other non-native species like the clams in the Delta, for example, that might be impacting the food web and causing competition? Was that addressed by the panel at all in the report?
I don't recall that they did look specifically at the clam issues, but certainly that is, in terms of looking at food web dynamics and food web support, that clearly is a significant piece. So actually, I'll look in the ecosystem piece and let you know. But they all are very much aware of that issue. And in terms of looking at food web support, that's really where I think the linkage is.
And sorry, just really quick, I think mainly the species that were looked at were all aquatic species, right? There weren't any sort of terrestrial, or amphibious Just wondering.
No, so they were, the charge was, the two components was to look specifically at the fish. In terms of ecosystem issues, they were really looking more at function than individual species. So they were looking more at processes than species focused.
Thank you.
Okay, so then to move on to the second topic I wanted to highlight is the recent solicitation or call for proposals that went out in September last year. A few things to focus here on are the fact that this was a multi-agency effort and really the first effort in a number of years where we were able to come together and come to similar priorities and similar funding mechanism. And that was with California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Stewardship Council, and with funding as well from the U.S. Department of, or the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. And so this, as I said, the call went out in September. We received 62 proposals, a request for $43 million. That's significantly more than has come in for the standalone proposals than the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has been able to do with the Prop 1 funding. So I think it really shows that by working together and leveraging our outreach, we were able to bring in a much broader group and be more selective in terms of identifying really the top funding opportunities. The Stewardship Council funded 15 proposals for a total of almost $10 million. We actually have typically we have about $5 million a year to go towards research. So we used all of that money. This year we had an additional $2 million from a one-time budget increase. And then we had money from the Bureau of Reclamation. And there were so many good proposals actually that we dedicated money from next year as well, out of our $5 million for next year to go towards this. So we funded that close to $10 million with our funds as well as the Bureau's funds. And then California Department of Fish and Wildlife funded 11 proposals for $7 million. So, over $16 million of funding, about a little over a third of the proposals or the funding requests that came in, we were able to fund. But so we were able to be pretty selective, and we funded a wide range of projects. We had it was really separate funding decisions by the council and the Department of Fish and Wildlife. The Bureau gave the money to the council, and so we made the funding decisions in coordination with the Bureau for those projects. But we had outside reviews. This was coordinated with California Sea Grant as well as UC Davis. Each proposal went to 3 outside reviewers. We had 2 separate review panels, one that had more of an academic sort of research merit focus, and one that had more of a management focus, one that we coordinated and one that CDFW coordinated. But we were able to get really some significant input in terms of the science merit as well and rigor, as well as the management applications. And then we coordinated with CDFW and with the Bureau in the final funding decision. So I think it was a lot of effort, but really definitely worth the effort in terms of identifying those really valuable projects. The projects that were funded, and this is only for the council, this doesn't include California Department of Fish and Wildlife's projects, but in terms of the projects that we funded, the entire effort was focused around the Science Action Agenda, and the Science Action Agenda for the new board members is an effort that was completed 2 years ago that was led by the science program, but incorporated input from all of the science community and stakeholders in the Delta to identify the priority science areas that aren't being addressed by individual agencies currently. And so you can see around there's these 5 areas: human dimensions or social science issues, monitoring, data management and modeling, science synthesis, the use of existing data to synthesize and improve our understanding, efforts around habitat restoration, and efforts around species of interest like the salmon and Delta smelt and other endangered species, and the stressors that are affecting those populations. So that's the mix that we funded. We intentionally wanted to look at a broad range of issues, and so we were able to fund across a wide range. You'll notice that human dimensions or social science is definitely the smallest piece of the pie. That's a function that we really didn't get a lot of proposals in that area, and we're really trying hard to cultivate more interest in social sciences. In terms of actual topics, if you're interested, I'd be happy to send you a list of the summary of the proposals. There's some short abstracts that our staff put together for our council that I think would be of interest for you. But they cover a wide range of issues from, looking at contaminant issues on salmon populations and smelt populations, looking at food web, at productivity issues and the transfer of that productivity into the food web, restoration issues and subsidence reversal and carbon dynamics and climate change issues. There's one proposal looking at evaluating the benefits of restored wetlands through looking at hunting activities and through recreational activities. There's another one looking at risks to levees. So there's a wide range there. And in addition, other proposals that were supported by CDFW. So I think that's my last slide for that. If anyone has any questions on the...
John, before you move on, two things that we talked about that I think would be useful. One is the fate of the projects that didn't get funded. There, as you said, there were a lot of really good proposals that didn't get funded. Is it win or lose, or will those be considered by other funders? Are there other ways that some of that science will be conducted?
Well, so our plan is every 2 years to have a call like this. So like we said, we've already spent some of next year's funding, and we'll be supporting science fellows next year. So we won't have funds from our funds at the science program. But CDFW will have another call for Proposition 1 shortly, and the applicants will be encouraged to resubmit. And actually, if applicants are listening, you haven't got your letter yet, but we're in the midst of preparing letters with some information from the panelists so that they'll get some feedback and can improve their proposals next time around. So I think, yeah, there were many good proposals that we weren't able to fund, and that hopefully... One thing that I didn't highlight, but that I should emphasize, is that we don't want to do this as a one-time thing. We want to really have some consistent funding for research so that the university researchers and others, there were agencies as well that received funding, that they know there's this opportunity and they'll be able to start growing their research, their students and their staff so that they can be better prepared the next time these opportunities come around.
And John, that leads to the second question about each of these efforts that have been funded have a certain period of time that is funded, but I think there's also this process for figuring out how to integrate these specific time-limited, budget-limited exercises for a longer-term contribution to science in the Delta. And can you talk about that?
So part of that gets at the synthesis issue. So taking information from individual studies and incorporate it in. So we get really, because from one individual study, we get a lot of valuable information, but we're not going to answer broad management questions as we start to see more and more of a trend across multiple studies. And that's when we're able to really convert the science into really strong management recommendations. But I will say that for each of the proposals, they were asked to, when they provide their final reports, not to just publish in the peer-reviewed literature, which we want to get that information out to scientists, but also to make the information understandable and available to managers and decision makers. So with some distillation of their findings that hopefully will be the step that will make that synthesis across reports much easier.
So along those lines, you had indicated that we could get a list, which I'd appreciate getting a list, but it strikes me that what I would find more interesting is that science synthesis. And is there, from previous grants, an ongoing effort on the science synthesis, or is that pretty much what you've been doing when you've been coming here anyway, picking, sort of the key reports and pulling together the reports, providing us with a synthesis? I'm just looking for where's the best place for us to access kind of the hot topics that could assist us as we move forward with the Bay Delta Plan, the voluntary agreements, or whatever going forward.
Well, so the last thing I'm going to talk about is the Salmon Resiliency Workshop, and I think those workshops are really a valuable way to bring a mix of scientists and managers together to discuss those issues and start to bring together the information. So I think those are really valuable opportunities. But then there are many additional avenues for synthesis, and there's so I think for the projects we've been funding in the past, we are trying to, we're requiring that project proponents provide some synthesis on their own. And then as we get more information around individual topics, then we're trying to pull that together and encourage either our staff or others to look at ways that we could bring that information together to make it more understandable and actionable. But yeah, so it's the Bay Delta Science Conference, the State of the Bay Delta Science report that comes out every 4 to 5 years is another important avenue where to sort of bring together that information. Okay, so just briefly, a few additional updates. I mentioned in previous updates that we've been working on updating the Delta Science Plan. That's an effort that the science program has been leading, but like the Science Action Agenda, really reflects input from the broad science community. The science plan is in its final little details of wordsmithing and edits and is going to the printer in the next week or two. And so I will definitely make sure that you get a copy of the updated science plan. I think in terms of thinking about some of the key components of what's in the science plan, it really focuses on awareness of climate change issues, incorporating social science as well as natural science issues, encouraging better communication between scientists and decision makers. So really thinking about what are the forums, what are the avenues that we can use to make for that better connection, and how can we facilitate that. Improving science governance, and also the development of what we're calling topic-specific science plans. So I think as the science plan was developed, a number of people said, this is really useful in terms of directing science and ensuring that we're doing collaborative science, but what are the issues, what are the topics that we need to be addressing? And so we're working with a number of other agencies to think about how do we develop that around critical issues within the Delta. In addition, the DPIC, the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee, recently endorsed a funding white paper, as well as they received a letter from the Delta Independent Science Board, to encourage us to be looking at more what the Independent Science Board is calling forward-looking science. So rather than doing the science just for today's problems, thinking about what should we be doing to address upcoming problems, especially around climate change, but not just climate change. New invasive species, land use changes, all kinds of those impacts. And so DPIC has set up 4 working groups. Michael George is the chair of one of the working groups. And they're looking at funding efficiency. The 4 groups are looking at issues around how do we ensure that the current funding we have is being used efficiently in providing the information of value. How do we ensure communication? What you all have brought up questions about and we've talked about is how do we make sure the science is actionable and is useful for decision makers? How do we ensure consistent and reliable funding for science? And Michael, that's the group that you're leading. And then the last group of how do we ensure that we're doing forward-looking science? So that is ongoing, and the plan is that those 4 groups will put together some implementation plans. So this previous effort really identified what are some challenging issues and what should we be thinking about. The challenge to those 4 working groups is how do we do this? How do we implement these efforts and really ensure that we're making progress? And they have the challenge to put that together before next November, before the DPIC meeting in November. So the plan is to have draft reports done at the end of the summer that then can be made available to the DPIC in November. So I think that's a really valuable effort. Joaquin, you were there when we discussed, and I think it should provide some really useful information for moving forward.
I agree, and we're fortunate to have Mr. George participating in that, and we'll also, what I've committed to the chair of the Delta Stewardship Council was that we would also be providing other staff as well to be helping with that. So we're looking forward to that. So.
Great. I think it is will be a valuable effort. And then I also wanted to let you know the Independent Science Board. So, the Independent Science Board that I've already mentioned is a group of 10 outside scientists who, in addition to the work for this, give input and advice to the Stewardship Council, specifically on the use of science around adaptive management in the Delta. And they provide outside independent reviews in addition to the panels and the advisory groups that we put together. They're currently working on a review of the Interagency Ecological Program that will be available as a public draft in the next few weeks. And they're also reviewing the entire monitoring effort that goes on within the Delta, putting an inventory together of all the efforts, the management links to management questions, and I think both of those will be of interest to you. And so as those develop, I'll be happy to update you on those. And then last, I wanted to talk about this paper that came out last year that was a result of a workshop that the science program put together with UC Davis and that focused on, as I said, salmon resiliency, salmon populations in the face of climate change. It was an all-day workshop that actually occurred in 2015, and then this took more time than typical, but it took a number of years for their report to come out. But the report actually was updated and went way beyond what was just part of the workshop. It was led by Bruce Herbold, retired from US EPA, but includes a number of other staff across the agencies across the Delta. And in terms of looking at this issue, what they really wanted to highlight was that there are many impacts to the salmon populations. These impacts have led to a reduction in the genetic diversity of the population, and that reduction in genetic diversity reduces their ability to respond or be resilient to stressors like climate change. They highlight that in terms of restoring resiliency, by restoring a diverse population, and one way to do that is by restoring habitat diversity. That's more likely to result in a diverse population. And that's illustrated here, that a mix of habitat opportunities are going to create opportunities for different individuals within the populations, create different traits, lead to more population diversity and more overall resilience. This focuses on habitat, but the similar things could be thought about in terms of flow dynamics. If we have a mix of characteristics on the flow, that also is going to lead to a diverse population. And they highlight that if you see here, the natural populations or wild populations have been declining over time. Hatchery populations have increased. That's led to, on the middle graph showing overall fitness or the overall condition of the wild population has been declining over time. Add into that climate change effects and the variability of the climate, and we all know that California naturally has a very variable climate and then is also changing and being amplified. And what that has led to is a reduction in the native population, the blue component of the last figure there, and less opportunity for the natural population to recover and respond. And so we need to change that trajectory, and as was mentioned in the biological goals, instead of having that blue line declining, get to a point where it's starting to increase. They identify 4 areas where we could improve resiliency, all focusing primarily on habitat issues, so improving upstream access. And I'll just show one of their figures where they highlight in terms of the Sacramento watershed, on the left, all the blue areas are areas that were historically available to the salmon populations, and then you can see the significant reduction. So increasing those opportunities where possible is really important. Increasing conditions within the lower part of the watershed as well, and restoring areas within the lower part of the watershed so that we can address things like food availability or water temperature or water quality. And this just highlights some of those opportunities where there are areas for restoration, whether it's wildlife areas or rice fields or areas with conservation easements. So the upstream access, the second bullet there in terms of reducing stresses, whether it's improving food availability through restoration or reducing water temperature and reducing stress on the juveniles in that regard. They also highlight that we should be thinking about not, restoring, they use that term, restoring life history diversity. So not just a single pulse of individuals that go out there, but having individuals, juveniles that are moving out at different times, thinking about how we benefit them at different stages in their life, all the way from the upper watershed down through the estuary and then out into the ocean and across that whole continuum of their life history back to adulthood and reproduction. And then they also highlight the need to address hatchery issues and think about how do we continue to work with the hatcheries so that they provide benefits in terms of growing the hatchery population, but don't have negative effects on the wild populations. And I think there's definitely a lot of work in that area currently, but still areas for improvement. So with that, if there's any overall questions, I'm happy to answer questions, or let me know if there's other information that you'd like me to, I'll be happy to provide to you.
Really appreciate you taking the time today and the discussion. So thank you.
Sure, great. Thank you very much.
You can stand and hold my hand if you want.
Mr. George, I think we've had a request, though, to flip items number 7 and 8. So, yeah, so we'll give you a break before. All right, well, we'll move on to informational item number 8. This is our annual report from the statewide advisory committee on cooling water intake structures with recommendations regarding implementation schedules contained in the water quality control policy on the use of coastal and estuarine waters for power plant cooling.
Yep. Good morning, Chair Esquivel and members of the board. My name is Kat Walsh. I'm the chief of the Ocean Standards Unit in the Division of Water Quality here at the State Water Board. We're here to present item 8, the 2019 report of the Statewide Advisory Committee on Cooling Water Intake Structures, more commonly known as the SACWIS. This is an annual report prepared by the SACWIS on grid reliability in California in relation to the compliance schedules set forth in the Water Quality Control Policy for cooling water intake structures, which is known as the OTC policy. And here to present the 2019 SACWIS report is Drew Bowen from the CEC. He's also a SACWIS committee member. And also here with me is Marley Wood, our Office of Chief Counsel, and Julie Johnson, the lead staff on the once-through cooling policy here at the State Water Board.
Good morning, Chair members. I'm excited to be here. This item is about the board's leadership on this issue. We've been at this now for the better part of a decade, and this was a solvable problem, and we're making great headway solving it. So at the breakfast table this morning, I was pleased to talk to my 10 and 11-year-old about what the problem is with marine life getting trapped in the intake structures in power plants, and then other smaller marine life that passes through being damaged by the structures, and how we've made progress. So this is just an update to let you know how we're doing. So the punchline really with this item is that we're not recommending any changes. You've got a compliance schedule, it's been working, and we don't anticipate any changes. However, we'll speak briefly about a study that the independent system operator is doing as we sit here, and that will reveal in the summer whether we need to come back and ask for an extension for one or maybe 2 power plants. So we will get back to you on that. This is kind of an overview of how we're doing in numbers. So the net qualifying capacity, which is really just the amount of power that these power plants collectively produce, is just over 20,000 megawatts. And as you see, the compliance to date, the second bullet there, we've gotten more than half of the power plants in terms of megawatts, eliminating the once-through cooling altogether. And we're on track to be just over 80% by the end of next year. So again, I think this is great progress, and I want to just show you here regionally, these power plants are up and down the state. You got Humboldt Bay at the north part of the state and near our border with Mexico. You've got South Bay and lots of power plants in between. So this has been a distributed problem throughout the state. And I'm going to shift now to the slide that just shows, I'm obviously not going to walk through all of these, but as you can see, these are organized by retirement date. So as early as 2010, Humboldt Bay retired, and the bottom of this list here shows Encina in Southern California, and there we had retirements of 4 of the units that total 844 megawatts just last December. Still have a ways to go, though, and this shows alphabetically because the dates vary. You've got a compliance date, but then some of the plants operators have said we're going to retire early. But if you look at this, again, we're on schedule to hit 2020 or earlier with a great number of them. You have the last remaining nuclear plant, Diablo Canyon, scheduled to cease operations in the middle of the next decade, and so once their cooling will be retired correspondingly at that time. And then there are a couple in Los Angeles that have retirement dates towards the very end of the next decade. Next slide just shows you the water use reduction. The blue line, you may have seen this slide before, but the blue line shows your compliance schedule that you established. The green line shows the actual design flow rates of those plants that are operating, because some of them have retired early, ahead of schedule. But the really important line is the red line. That's the actual flows that are going through the system. And the reason it's lower than the other lines is we have some power plants, very large power plants, that are only operating at a very low capacity, sometimes in the single digits, 5, 6, 7%. So they may be dormant throughout the year, but in July, August, when we really need that extra power boost, they go on for a certain number of hours per day and are utilized in that capacity. So the actual flow is quite a bit lower. In fact, the max flow approached 16,000 million gallons a day, and the actual flow today is about a quarter of that. So again, I think really noteworthy progress. How are we doing this? Coincidentally, while we're trying to undertake this effort, we've had a move away from these conventional power plants, so the timing has been auspicious. In addition, there's been a focus in California, as you know, on preferred resources. Those include energy efficiency, which we've done a really good job of increasing in California, distributed generation, so rooftop solar and wind and that sort of thing, and energy storage is growing in the state as well. So these forces have helped us achieve these goals. We also get transmission from out of state that can bring in electricity to help meet our needs. And finally, we do have a couple plants that have repowered. Many have retired, but some have repowered without using once-through cooling. And so they provide contributions to our fleet as well. The issue I alluded to at the beginning that may put a little wrinkle in this temporarily is described here. There's a project called the Mesa Loop-In Project, which is a transmission upgrade in Southern California, just east of Los Angeles. And the ISO is doing a study right now because the project was delayed for a year, and so they're taking a look at the power we've got down there and making a judgment about whether it's going to be adequate to keep the lights on. Because we've done all this, our job as SACWIS has been to help you navigate your compliance schedule while keeping the lights on throughout California. We've done that. We want to keep doing that. So this study will help us determine whether we need to come back and ask for an extension at probably just one of the two, either Alamitos or Redondo, Southern California power plant. Finally, again, no recommendations for change. We're going to continue to look at this, and we may be back in the summer, but if we find that the study reveals there is no issue, we won't be. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Great news. Any questions from fellow board members? Hearing no questions. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate the update.
Thank you.
Yeah. Reprising their roles, Delta Water Master Michael George and Hannah. Reprising and switching. Good to have you back up, Doctor.
Well, good morning again. I appreciate the opportunity to make a report of the activities of the Office of Delta Water Master. And I've asked John to come back because some of the questions that we talked about in his presentation actually dovetail quite nicely with some of the things that I want to describe in terms of our work. So in terms of overview, quick review of what the role of the Office of the Delta Water Master is and what pies we've got our fingers in. Some of the work that we're doing in terms of improving data collection so that we know more about what's going on in the water use community within the Delta. Challenges that we're facing and trying to resolve with respect to implementing the SB 88 diversion measurement requirements. Then I want to really put a spotlight on the deterioration of ecosystem services in the southern part of the Delta, and then talk about what responses we're working on right now with respect to planning for climate change. So quickly, role of the Delta Water Master. This role was created in the 2009 Delta Reform Act, and it's unique in that I report both to your board and to the Delta Stewardship Council. So as a result of that, I'm kind of a liaison between the two. And I do appreciate, Chair Esquivel, the benefit of having more support for that liaison activity and the discussions that we've been having with the Stewardship Council Chair to increase the resources that we put into that joint effort. So statutorily, my role is really to administer the water rights in the Delta, to enforce your board orders and terms and conditions of water diversion and use within the Delta, and more generally to assist with realization of the co-equal goals of increasing the reliability of our water supply and improving the Delta ecosystem in a way that takes account of the evolving circumstances in the Delta. And to do that, a lot of my work is what I call here outreach and liaison with Delta constituents. The different constituents in the Delta, it is not a monolith, it's very different in different areas of the Delta with different concerns and different impacts. I'll focus a little bit later, particularly on the southern Delta. And then because there are so many agencies that are working in the Delta, I've also got a role, and my group has a role, not only working with the Delta Stewardship Council and with the Bay Delta unit of our Division of Water Rights, but with fish agencies, with advisory groups, et cetera, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And finally, because of all this work, I view my role as well as assisting you in the portion of your mind share that you devote to the Delta. Obviously, you've got a lot of things across the board that you focus on in terms of water quality and drinking water and funding and so forth. But when you focus on the Delta, we view it as our role to help you organize how you do that. So next thing I'm going to focus on is what we've done to meet one of the big challenges that we all recognized in the long-running drought, and that is that when push came to shove and we had shortage conditions, we didn't have the data to both inform the water community and to organize our own responses. So one of the things that we've been doing at your direction all the way along is to make sure that we are learning from that experience and improving our experience, our capabilities going forward. So one of the big things in that was to create the first taxonomy of senior water rights in the Delta, which we got through a cooperative effort between our office and the Division of Water Rights to take all the information that we'd gleaned from the 2015 information order and make it usable, and to put it out there so that it could be crowd corrected. This is what we understood about the senior water right claims in the Delta, the riparian pre-14, and we put it all out there, and we have been getting continuously crowd correction of that. People coming in and saying, you've got this a little bit wrong, or these two things overlap, et cetera. So in addition to mining all that data from the 2015 information order, we've made a big push to make sure we get timely reports of water diversion and use. Those are required by statute and regulation, but as you know, there have been long-term problems in getting those reports in on time. And I'd like to say that we have made great progress in solving that problem, not so much just from our office, but from that outreach and liaison work that I talked about before, because we've cultivated very strong partnerships with the 3 Delta water agencies, such that, for instance, on April 1st of this year, the reports of licensees were due. Actually, that was Cesar Chavez Day, so that they were actually due on April 2nd. On April 3rd, my office put out a list of all of those who were delinquent. And number one, you'll be pleased to know that the number was very small, but less than 10%. Sent it out to the 3 Delta water agencies, and I can report today that we have 0 delinquencies. There's one that still isn't in. It was a change of ownership. We're working with them to capture the data from their prior owner, but we will have 100% compliance. That allows us to move from the compliance issue to the next thing, moving from compliance to improving the quality of those reports. So one of the things we did to get more people to report on time is to make it clear that the late submissions get the most analysis and attention from us. So if you want to get less attention, get in on time. But we've tried through that process to identify what are the common errors that are in those reports. We've tried to identify them for the water community, for the water agencies in the Delta, so that we get continuous improvement. We've also, as you know, put out our views about how to clarify water rights issues that are confusing or confounding in these reports. Probably chief among those is the overlap memo that helps allow people who are claimants of both pre-14 and riparian rights to make sure that they are reporting on a basis that is consistent with the law of California in both of those. We also do a lot of outreach to individuals. We make visits. And we always look at those visits as two-way street. We go out, we try and help people understand what we're looking for, but we're also trying to learn from them what their challenges are, what we can do to help. It's one of the areas where we find that people ask us to make changes to our electronic reporting system so that it's clearer, more consistent, easier. For the most part, we find people in good faith want to comply. We give them as much help as we can, but we also try and bring back to you and to our colleagues in the data management unit ideas for improving the system. And finally, of course, we enforce to ensure that the people who are complying know that they're getting a level playing field, because we're enforcing against those who are not consistently reporting or who are reporting inaccurately, and get them improved. So the overall objective here, on which I think we're making great progress, is to be in a better position to manage future shortages through stronger data reliability. That's not only for us, but also for the community. What I see in the future is a circumstance where our data is trusted and is used by the community, because I'm very aware that we avoided serious disruption of our economy in the last drought, not so much through our efforts at managing the water system, but by the efforts of the water managers out there. So not only having better information from us, but information for them to do better planning. And we're seeing that all the time. For instance, in the Delta, we're seeing people enter into contracts to shore up their water rights, to be prepared to deal with shortage conditions based on the information that we've provided them. So that's kind of good news. I want to turn now to some less good news, which is to describe the challenges that we've got in terms of implementing the regulations for diversion measurement in the Delta. What we found here, and I've reported on before, is that many of the early installations simply failed in terms of their ability to meet the regulatory requirement. We found serious equipment failures in the Delta because of harsh conditions. Stuff that's floating in the water gets fouled in the measurement devices, et cetera. We found specific and so far unresolved issues in measuring the flow through a siphon. It turns out to be a significant challenge that we have not yet met. And part of that is because, I mean, you've got a picture there of one siphon that's on Staten Island. That is a siphon, that's a new siphon. It was built by the owner of Staten Island, the Nature Conservancy, one of the real proponents of SB 88 and measurement. In early 2016, they brought us out there and they said, look, we spent $40,000 on measuring this siphon accurately, and what we've realized is that that money has not resulted in anything like the kind of consistency or accuracy that the law and regulations require. And in addition, so many of these siphons, because the Delta has not consolidated its diversions, there's so many of these siphons that are used very intermittently, sometimes a few days during a couple of months of the growing season, sometimes intermittently in one year and not in another year, depending on different crop use and hydrological conditions. So the notion of accurately measuring every one of these when you intermittently turn them on, turn them off, you've got different staff out there, et cetera, has proved to be a really vexing problem. And our response to that has been to convene this Delta Measurement Experimentation Consortium to bring together people to help us figure out how to meet these challenges. And this is just a list of some of the people, some of the organizations that are on our consortium. We meet about quarterly to share insights and information that we've gleaned from the various experiments that are going on throughout the Delta. And the kind of mantra is there are an infinite number of mistakes to make. We don't need to repeat mistakes that somebody has made and can describe and can figure out how to overcome. So this consortium has been extremely valuable, particularly, I will say, in helping those who divert through pumps to come into compliance. And we've focused on the largest diverters in the Delta, so big diversions like Reclamation District 999 and 2068. We're working right now, in fact, today with the Negley-Burke Irrigation District in the South Delta. So we've focused on some of the big diversions that are pump-oriented, where the problems have essentially been reduced, if not completely solved, and we're moving toward compliance in those areas. However, we're also focusing, and I want specifically to focus on what I am viewing as a potentially more viable alternative for reaching the objectives behind SB 88, and that is to use computer analysis of satellite images to more accurately estimate the evapotranspiration of crops. That's the key issue that we can come to management on. Within the Delta, it's crop water use that can be managed. We can't manage the riparian habitat. We can't manage the evaporation from open water. We can't manage the ET, let's say, of invasive weeds, but we can manage the evapotranspiration of crops if we can understand it and do so in real time. So this board made a significant investment in a 2-year study with the Center for Watershed Science, where we developed and demonstrated that the science of satellite imagery could be effectively used in the Delta. There was a lot of disagreement about that. The Delta is so gnarly and complicated and so forth. You got winds and channels and all kinds of other stuff. But we demonstrated through that study that that we could accurately measure crop ET. Now we're moving from that science through this Open ET project, in which we are a significant participant, but it's really being driven by the NGO community and funded initially by the philanthropic community, by foundations. But that process over a 5-year project period will result in taking the science and moving it from the peer-reviewed journals, putting it on your smartphone. The advantage there is that everybody will know what the ET is of crops down to field level throughout the Delta. Ultimately, we're going to go broader than the Delta, but for reasons that I'll describe, I think the Delta is the place to start this process. The field measurement that we're doing could become the ground truthing and the calibration rather than the method for measuring diversions going forward. So why is the Delta the place to roll this out? First of all, there's no storage in the Delta. So you don't have the complicating factor of missing diversion to storage if you're not measuring diversions but measuring crop water use. Secondly, if you over-divert in the Delta, that water returns to the system very close in terms of time and location. So if there's more water diverted onto the island than the crops need, that goes back out into the system very quickly. So by using the measurement of ET of the crops, we'll get a more consistent and importantly more timely indication of what the water use is in the Delta than we can possibly get through diversion measurement, which is, except for the very largest producers, those who divert at one point of diversion more than 10,000 acre feet, except for those which are going to be telemetered as of next January, the other information that we get from the individual diversion measurements doesn't come in till their annual reports. So we don't know until the following growing season what happened in the last growing season. By using remote sensing of satellite data, we get timely information across the entire Delta to focus on different crops in different areas and have that information available in relatively real time so that we can make decisions, and more importantly, so that farmers and water agencies can make decisions based on hydrological conditions. Now, I think this is the alternative that we should pursue, but I recognize that it would require a change at least to the regulations implementing SB 88 and probably to SB 88, which is now codified at Water Code Section 1840 and 41. So assuming that we continue to get through the consortium process and through the development of ET, the data we need to make this case that this alternative is better, I'm fully cognizant of the fact that we're going to need to go first to your board, then to agency, then to the administration in order to get the code changed. So that's kind of where we are on the big issues that we're focusing on. But I now want to turn to what I call the really bad news, which is the accelerating rate of deterioration of the Southern Delta. And why is that important? It makes it much more complicated for us to meet the co-equal goals. It reduces ecosystem services substantially in the South Delta. It impedes fish passage from the San Joaquin, its tributaries, out to the ocean and back. And importantly, it is constricting capital formation in the Delta. That is, because of the instability, particularly in the South Delta, it's very hard to organize capital to improve facilities or to make progress against some of our ecological objectives. And because of all of that, it seriously increases the conflict in that part of the Delta. So these two maps you've seen before. On the left is the map of Eco Restore, which focuses on that arc from, let's say, the Fremont Weir out through the Sassoon Marsh, the northwest arc where we're making some progress. On the right is the Central Delta Corridor Partnership, which is aimed at pulling together publicly owned land in that Cosumnes, Mokelumne, San Joaquin River corridor in the central delta out to the western delta. But what's consistent in both of these is nothing happening in terms of active restoration in the South Delta. There's no plan, there's no money, there's no vision, and it is deteriorating badly as we focus importantly elsewhere. And there are those in the scientific community who say the South Delta is already so degraded that it's not a good place to spend precious resources. But I want to make sure, as we think about that, that we're focusing on what the implications of that bypass is. So the first one is sediment buildup, which is increasing water temperature in the southern delta. It's increasing the number and consistency of toxic blooms, and it's increasing the constituencies of concern in that part of the delta. It's reducing net flows in those delta channels. It's reducing dissolved oxygen, which is critical for fish and other aquatic wildlife. It's expanding the range of invasive species. That picture you saw just a moment ago is at the end of Tom Paine Slough in the South Delta, totally occluded by native species. It's seriously impeding navigation. When I go out there in a boat and try to get to a certain place where I want to inspect a diversion or a return flow, there are lots of places where you just cannot get through. So that's a problem for me, but it's a real problem for recreational boating and so forth. It reduces the ability to do flood response and to maintain the levees. And the salinity buildup promotes hotspots, which create problems for us from a regulatory and meeting our water quality objectives. So this problem of sedimentation has become serious enough, and the picture there was taken in December of 2018 after we'd had big flows. And what happened was those flows don't go through the delta, through the South Delta anymore. It results in this kind of sedimentation. This is an oxbow on Old River right near Tracy Boulevard, which incidentally is one of the hot spots for our regulatory process. So a group of people who are affected by these problems have come together. We've got representatives, not only the state board, our office, and support from the Bay Delta unit of the Division of Water Rights, but also the Department of Water Resources and USBR, who obviously are dependent upon these South Delta channels for some of the flow to their pumps. But also San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority, the South Delta Water Agency, and others. And what this group has done is pulled together basically a problem statement explaining what's going on and what the impacts of that are. And the idea then is to begin to promote this with various agencies who will participate in an open, transparent process for looking at what the problem is and what the solutions might be. Now, obviously, there are some obstacles here to dredging these channels, including permitting, the expense not only of the permitting and the ecological mitigation, but also just managing and maintaining the sediment removal. And then focusing as well on some of the uncertainties about how you balance the impacts. On the one hand, you can see that that channel is not a very good channel for fish or wildlife. On the other hand, it's the Fish and Wildlife agencies who are concerned about how you dredge, when you dredge. That concern has changed over time as we've recognized that there are certain times when it's okay to dredge, when additional turbidity in the water can actually be beneficial. But the idea here is for this ad hoc group to come forward with a problem statement and then enlist our agency and others. We're working with Region 5 on this problem because they've got water quality authority in the Southern Delta. But trying to bring together a coalition to look at the problem and suggest some solutions.
I have a question on that. So is it your intention to just keep really focused on siltation, or are you looking at perhaps addressing that and then broadening it, for example, hyacinth removal?
Clearly, one of the problems with what you're seeing there in the siltation is that it promotes the growth not just of hyacinth, which is a floating weed, but primrose. And you get primrose in those banks, that nice wet soil where they can put their roots down, and you've got a real problem. Primrose has actually been retarded by hyacinth. So if you treat the hyacinth, the primrose is able to better connect. So absolutely, we need to look at this as a problem that's not just remove the sediment, but by removing the sediment, and as you remove the sediment, also physically removing some of those invasive weeds. And particularly with hyacinth, if you can mechanically remove it, put it out in the field to dry, it releases its water pretty quickly, and it provides some organic matter. So it is a symbiotic approach to managing siltation, as well as some of those other factors that I listed there on the prior slide. And salinity hotspots. Now this map actually shows the areas on Old and Middle River where DWR and their bathymetry measurement group have identified specific areas where salinity, where sedimentation has increased the salinity issues that we're facing there. And what we're doing here is recognizing that this has significant impacts to beneficial uses of agriculture along those reaches of Old and Middle River. Generates conflicts between users, the projects, let's say, for export purposes, and the farmers who divert for agricultural purposes, let alone the fish that are trying to swim through these occluded high salinity channels. And unfortunately, just relaxing the standard, as your board did in adopting the Phase 1 SED in December, didn't solve the problem. In fact, we had an exceedance of the new relaxed standard the next month in January, a period of relatively high flow. So the problem is complicated and difficult to approach.
Did that exceedance happen in one of the hotspot areas that you point out here on the map?
Yes, we measure at 4 places in the South Delta. The exceedance that I'm most familiar with is the worst hotspot, which is the Tracy Boulevard crossing of Old River. So even though we maintained the 700 EC at the threshold of the Delta at Fernalis, we still, in January, relatively high flow period of the year, but in a low flow portion of the Delta, because of this sedimentation, we experienced a hotspot. So again, we've convened an ad hoc process here, and what we're trying to do, the objective here is to synthesize, to go back to Board Member D'Adamo's question, and one of the reasons I asked John to sit up here and hold my hand, is this synthesis of what we know about salinity in the South Delta. There have been reports, studies, and other projects to identify the responsibilities, the potential solutions, et cetera. And what we're going to try and do is synthesize that so that our current generation of managers and regulators can start from a common sense for what we know and what we don't know. We've convened this group. We've created an oversight board of those who operate in the Delta, but we've asked John, as Delta's lead scientist, to convene a panel of outside experts with hopefully expertise and experience and insight in the Delta to do that synthesis for us. But the interaction between that panel and the oversight committee is designed, number one, to make sure that the oversight committee has the final say, that it's objective, but that they have the benefit of the insights of these people who are operating in the Delta, who have essentially a dog in the fight and are informed by their positions. But I also think of that, frankly, as kind of group therapy, because instead of simply pointing fingers at each other, it's your fault, it's your problem, I haven't got any money, you should surcharge somebody. Instead, I'm hopeful that this process will get those members of the Oversight Committee to have to sit together and listen to each other describe the problem from their various perspectives. And obviously, the objective here is to move away from the finger pointing that has been the way this has been managed or unmanaged for a long time, and to move toward a more collaborative approach to remediation that frankly doesn't just revolve around a few deep pockets or a few muscular facilities. But because of all of this that I've talked about, the Southern Delta remains the killing fields for outmigrating salmon. And so you've got those cute little salmon smolts there on the right. And on the left is a quote, and this is not new. This is a quote from a fish bio study back in 2014. I haven't even mentioned predation. This quote is focused primarily on predation. But a lot of the factors that we have focused on lead to this being a very difficult passage for those smolts. So to the extent that we're trying to build native communities on the San Joaquin and in its tributaries, we've got to deal with the killing fields of the Southern Delta. So then we move to the elephant in the waiting room, climate change, which is going to change all of this and none of it for the better. So this again is where we focus on coordination. John mentioned the first of those two bullet points, the Delta Science Funding Government's Implementation Initiative, which we're working on. And again, great to have additional staff from the State Board to help that process. And secondly, there's the Stewardship Council has taken leadership in developing a program, two-year program, well-funded, with serious consulting support and scientific community input to look at the Delta in terms of what is its vulnerability to climate change. What are the kinds of things that we're going to face? We know we're going to have a warmer water estuary. We know that we're going to have more salinity intrusion. We know we're going to have a higher water level on the outside of delta levees, which may become more vulnerable as you have a lowering of the farming table on one side and an increase in the water table on the other side against these levees. And the objective here is to drive everything that we're doing to this one Delta, one science, where advocates and scientists and managers and regulators and operators can be pulled into, pushed into, forced into a community environment in which they get to test each other and their points of view, and where they get to improve the quality of the science, improve the Delta Science Plan, and the whole process. So thank you for your time and patience. That's what we're doing in the Office of the Delta Water Master these days.
No small amount of work. Any questions or comments from my colleagues?
Well, congratulations on filing and that terrific statistic. We don't often hear 100% compliance or ever, so that was terrific. My question just goes to the ultimate goal there, to have folks in the Delta ready for the next drought. And so what sort of conversations are ongoing relative to that in terms of preparation now versus we'll have this information and that this will better assist us when we have the uncomfortable conversation about curtailment?
So first of all, we're trying to build on what was successful in 2015, which was a voluntary effort. You'll recall that diverters in the Delta came forward and said, if you will agree not to curtail us more as the summer wears on, we'll agree to reduce our diversions by 25% early in the season. And there was a very effective voluntary effort to manage diversions in the Delta to reduce the pressure on the system. We're building on that through a lot of the same people and processes that came together there to promote exactly that conversation. How will we respond in the future? I got to say, we've made some progress on that, but there is a kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, in that there is this economically driven move from annual crops to permanent crops. That reduces your ability to absorb the natural changes in hydrology. So that's going forward because mechanization is one of the responses to the lack of labor, the lack of immigration reform at the federal level. People are moving to mechanized crops. They're moving to higher value crops with longer shelf life. You know, today, if you're in the Delta, you'd rather be growing almonds than cherries because of the weather. We're losing a lot of the cherry crop today. So we're seeing farmers move in response to market conditions, regulatory conditions, et cetera. But I go back to saying one of the real problems, particularly in the Southern Delta, but it's true throughout, because the Delta is currently unsustainable, it's also very difficult to organize capital to make new investments. If you don't know whether the levee that protects your property is going to be there, it's hard to go to your banker and propose an investment in anything that's protected behind that levee.
The second question goes to maybe more of a suggestion. I was at a dinner last week, and I'll report on it later, but it was just an informal gathering in Los Banos, water users, NGO, and public officials. And there was representation from the Delta. It was actually sought out to include them in the discussion. And one of the things that came up was just in this socialization opportunity to just get folks around the table and talk about collaboration rather than conflict. One of the things that came up was that there has been some progress in the Delta around these conflicts. And so rather than asking you to specifically mention that today, maybe just think about in future reports, either including it in your report where there has been maybe not broad scale change, but even in specific areas that can help to highlight areas of collaboration, because we so often hear about the conflict, and it was really heartening to hear about some of this progress. I can talk with you a little bit more offline, or even where there are parties that have been able to work out a challenging issue for them to come in here and report, be good for us to hear, and then also, because this is on the web, talk about some positive things that are going on in the Delta.
So I appreciate the suggestion, and I'll give you just a couple of anecdotes. that fit into that. A week ago today, I was at the Central Delta Water Agency Board meeting. And in addition to listening and learning and responding to questions and everything, I had a real message for them, which was step back from the siege mentality of fearing the change and so forth, and look at the opportunity that is here. The water fix has been withdrawn. It's going to take a while for that to be redeveloped and so forth. It's out there, but it's not immediate. What is immediate is the process that's going on to try and find these voluntary agreements to meet ecological objectives. And my message was, you in the Central Delta, and I'll do it next month in the South Delta, this is an opportunity for you to come forward with the things that have been stuck, that you've needed to have done, you've wanted to have done, you know will be improvements to the Delta. You can get into that conversation, not just as in a protective mode, but in a contributing mode. And in that room last Tuesday, there were the tried and true old warriors who just said, we don't trust anybody, we're going to fight everything, we're going to litigate till hell won't have it. But there was other discussion around the table, and since that meeting last Tuesday, I've gotten 3 phone calls from people who were in that room saying, how could we get involved? Because there's stuff that is a no-brainer, everybody should want to do. How do we get that on the table? So I think that kind of discussion, I always think of the Delta as having plan A, which is fight everything, leave us alone, we want to be the way it's always been. But there's the plan B, which is a growing group which recognizes that they can't be left alone, that they have responsibilities with the rest of California, because they are in the crossroads, and they recognize that change is happening, and they'd rather get involved and help it happen in a way that takes account of their needs and interests. The biggest problem in the Delta is the sense that they're being called upon to be sacrificed for the good of the whole state. And so what I'm trying to do is get them to recognize you've got to be cognizant of the good of the whole state. We are not going to cut off Southern California and damage the state's economy. That's not a responsible option. But it's also not a responsible option to destroy the Delta in order to maintain those other values. So, get involved, bring some solutions. All 3 of the Delta water agencies have assessment capability. That's a pretty powerful tool. Bring some money, bring some know-how, and I'm a former banker. I think of money as the universal lubricant. The golden rule, who's got the gold rules? Bring some money, get in the game.
Any other questions or comments? Yeah, I think, it is a false dichotomy. We don't have to sacrifice the Delta and maintain the state's economy. I mean, we can do both, but it is going to require everybody to come to the table and realize that, there's, I guess what the saying goes, there's really two tactics in water rights or water generally: divert and delay. And, we just can't necessarily do that any longer. So, yeah. Thank you so much. Really appreciate. And, on the issue of collaboration, I did appreciate, Mr. George, the fact that you brought up the Open ET project. For me, it's those sort of tools, those common decision support tools that people can all trust, use for their own various purposes. But hopefully, when we talk about the difficulties in measuring diversions within the Delta, maybe there are these lower cost tools, remote sensing tools that can help us better manage our resources in a lower cost way, but with the outcomes that we really are looking for. So maybe,
that is a major accomplishment. And I think in the science community, people really appreciated that, bringing together all the mix of approaches that were considered and really carefully evaluating them so that we can make progress. I think that's the kind of science progress that I think will be really useful.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for your work and leadership. Thank you both. All right, that leaves us now with item number 9, board member reports. I will entertain any reports from my fellow board members they would like to provide. And if there are none, that's
No,
okay
I
too.
can go. I would think I went last time, so maybe I'll go first. So after our last board meeting, we had an amazing tour by the Reading office of the Central Valley Water Board, and it was so interesting and great to get. We had a lot of participation from different agencies, including federal agencies, and I thought the Iron Mountain mine was fascinating. I had never heard of it before, and just like what they went through with the fire and what they do every day is pretty amazing. So that was really wonderful, and it was great to learn more about the fire recovery efforts and the work that the State Water Board staff has been doing with Region 5 and local partners to try to get on top of some of the fire recovery efforts that need to make sure that we're preventing more pollution and more impacts from those. And I think there was a lot of really good learning. Some of that I think was reflected in the presentations around emergency response. Unfortunately, there's going to be more emergencies and fires. And so how are we best using the resources we have and learning from the experience we have? And there's, I think I'm really glad to hear all the collaboration and learning that's going on there and be able to see some of that firsthand. So thanks for everyone involved in enabling us to take that tour and see that firsthand, get up to Reading. Just really, really enjoyed that. And after that, I was able to go both to San Diego for Region 9 and to LA, or actually Agora Hills to be precise, for Region 4 for those meetings. And it's interesting because, in Region 4, they're also dealing with wildfire problems and recovery and, super fun sites and sites, I think Santa Susana, or maybe getting that wrong, but that was something like that you can correct me, so I think you just see all these impacts that are happening throughout the state in really every region relating to that emergency response and vulnerable facilities and all kinds of impacts that I think are beyond maybe what we know, in part because people are working so hard to prevent more severe impacts from occurring. So appreciate that. Learned a lot. There's I think a couple things I wanted to mention. I was able to talk to the California Agricultural Council at their legislative day, and it was great to connect with a lot of those folks, hear about, I think they had lots of good questions, and I was not able to go, but there were a couple events because I was sick after traveling a lot. But I wanted to highlight a couple of things that I was going to attend that I think are events to just raise that I think are good to follow up on. One is there was a thought leaders workshop that I know our staff participated in related to that KUA put on related to a water research foundation grant in partnership with the Pacific Institute. And there were just folks from all over the state that were talking about really looking at new approaches and learning around addressing drinking water challenges for small rural communities or small urban communities. so I'm really looking forward to hearing more about what that project and what they're learning came out of that. There was a tour in LA around drinking water challenges that I was going to go to, but I was sick for, that went to Sativa and Maywood and Linwood, which are all facing challenges, and I think help highlight the attention and political attention that's going on right now to hopefully secure a safe and affordable drinking water fund. The last thing I wanted to mention was I got a briefing from GARE, which is the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, that actually is a national effort, but we have a cohort here at Cali, PA, and at the state level, and also at the Water Board. And so I'm really excited about the learning that's going on at all levels of government to promote more diversity and equity and inclusion. And I think I'm hopeful at some point we could get a briefing with the state at one of our meetings and talk more about how we integrate that into our priorities. So thanks.
Thank you. And that's a great suggestion.
I have no assignments for staff this time. But just a couple things from my fellow board members. Since I did report on the adaptation atlas at our last board meeting in Reading, I believe you, at least some of you, should by now received an email offering briefing on that topic, and I encourage you to do so.
You.
It's a fascinating project. And then my other thing is actually a request for Board Member Diadamo. I was not able to attend the tour as well as workshop in Napa relating to the winery permit. I know that you were able to, so I'm hoping you can report on that, and I will join you in San Luis Obispo for Thursday's events.
Oh, great.
Okay, yes, I attended the first round of tours in Mendocino County. We were in Hopland. I reported on that already, and then we followed up with a outreach meeting, and then there was an outreach meeting in Lodi, and then last week tour Honig Winery and Farniente, and what I'm really picking up on is just the differences, the regional differences. I know that our staff has spent a lot of time on this, but I think they're learning also as we're out in the field. And there's just been, I think because of the drought and also this movement that in some areas of the state, they're really wanting to do deficit irrigation, stress the plant because they end up with better quality for those wine lovers, that understand that. And so because of these efficient practices, they've gotten more focused also on water use efficiency in their processing operations as well. And so they're doing steam cleaning, also reduction of chemical use through steam cleaning as opposed to using chemicals or switching out to less harmful chemicals. And so really learning a lot, and then had at Napa Community College a filled room with winery operators, but also a lot of the consultants. So they were asking a lot of technical questions. I don't know that we'll have the big crowd in San Luis Obispo. I think that it would just happen to be a good location there in Napa because of the number of facilities. I'm really hoping that we can have another round of briefing before the next draft that comes out. I think that's the plan anyway. So. Of course, I can't share much more than that, but I know staff will be reporting back to all of us on some of the things they learned from the tours. I was in Region 3 last week. They are updating their ag order. They call it 4.0. And so staff outlined a conceptual framework for all of the different program areas and aspects of the order. It was very lengthy, 2 full days into the evening discussion. So I was there for most of it. ML Wadwani is participating and has been called on throughout the discussion because of their interest in better understanding the implications of our precedential order, where it's precedential, where it's not precedential. And so she is just an essential resource for them, and really want to thank OCC for allowing that to happen. Hopefully that'll help us maybe limit some of the time that we'll have to spend on in the future. While I was there, I just really want to thank Board Member Firestone and staff that had been also working on, and there was some email traffic that I was involved in regarding replacement water in and around the Pajaro, I don't know the exact name, but the Pajaro Community Services District. And Region 3, it's just been really exciting to see the evolution over there in Region 3, because now we have Community Water Center in Watsonville. There's just been a lot of collaboration between the regional board, the county, and just better information about some of these trouble spots where folks are drinking contaminated water. And so Region 3 stepped up and suggested that we use cleanup and abatement funds. They put in a request, and I know that they were working with our staff and then also with Board Member Firestone and myself. And they were responsive enough that I was able to, in my report, say that staff thinks that they might be eligible for the cleanup and abatement funds, and they do see a pathway for replacement water. I think it would be for as many as 200 households. So they were just, the board was very appreciative, and they did comment that on this issue in particular, they sense greater collaboration with our board, and they appreciate the ability to be involved. This is a passion for them. So hopefully there will be more to come in other areas in Region 3. I already mentioned that I was at that dinner in Los Banos. I was at a similar dinner while I was at Aqua, and Board Member McGuire and Escobar were also there, and these are just wonderful opportunities. So I know that there's an interest to get all of us involved in some of these more informal discussions, and I always go away feeling more hopeful and with a can-do spirit. So want to encourage just doing that as much as possible. And then also while at Aqua, I updated the Legal Affairs Committee on the voluntary agreements, and then also mentioned that the recruiting, and this is maybe Mr. Loeffler can mention this as well, because I'm not remembering the exact dates, but we have opened up the recruiting process for the presiding administrative hearing officer for the newly formed unit. And so I provided that information to the committee, and I know Jenny Buckman is going to also help to distribute the information and filing period.
Yeah, and I'll just go ahead and, if I can, seize the opportunity here to mention that we did post up last Friday an announcement for the presiding administrative hearing officer. Ms. Buckman has followed through, and that has gone out to all the attorneys on the Aqua Legal Affairs Committee. We have distributed it widely as well. It's going out on the Dividing the Waters and National Judicial College mailing lists. So we are hopeful to get a rich candidate pool for you all to consider and to draw from. So that's a terrific step forward for us, and then that office will ultimately, that presiding administrative hearing officer will then populate the rest of that office.
Fantastic. Yeah, looking forward to that process.
And I think I left out that the applications would be due by June 7th.
June 7th is the deadline for applications? Good. Yeah, we're really looking forward to a very robust and strong sort of process and trying to find the best person we can. And it's going to be a great boon to our work to have that office set up and being able to work through what is going to be a continuingly large workload on the water rights side as we try to do our best to meet all of our obligations.
But they won't have any failure to files coming out of the Delta.
No, they won't. No, they won't. And I was looking forward. I was going to be the presiding officer on our failure files this year, but I think we've winnowed them down to that's it. We started with 68. There was like 68, I think, back in December, and it was like, oh, but it's slowly gone away. And thanks for doing your part on this year's tranche. Board member reports on my part. That tour was quite incredible. We're really fortunate for the leadership of the regional board and our staff. I've never toured a Superfund site. It was my first time, and was incredibly impressed by the scale and scope of the work and the acid mine drainage that comes out of Iron Mountain Mine. And to think that up until the mid-90s, early 90s, that was just dumping into the Sacramento River. We talk about now the stressors and, what are we looking at and what is it that's most affecting our salmon populations and our native fish populations generally. But, we have such a legacy, an incredible legacy in this state, and a mixed one. And we have these artifacts like Iron Mountain Mine, which are, we did things when we didn't really understand what it was that we were ultimately doing. But anyway, we were very fortunate to tour around. I was incredibly impressed. And then obviously all the great work in the region around fire recovery. After that, I drove down to Aqua, and Wade Crowfoot, Secretary Crowfoot, and I swapped spots at Aqua. I was supposed to give a keynote on Thursday. He was doing the opening breakfast on Wednesday, and we swapped that around. So I quickly made my way down to Monterey after the board meeting, and did the opening keynote breakfast, stuck around that day, and then the next day moderated a drinking water panel, and then participated in a voluntary agreement panel. All very good discussions. The administration was well represented at this year's Aqua. I feel the administration kind of carried Aqua. You're welcome, Aqua. We made it an entertaining, I think, but if not, also an informative and engaging sort of time there. And I think people really appreciated seeing Wade, Secretary Crowfoot, seeing Secretary Blumenfeld, and myself and our fellow board members there as well. It was good to see you there and have that strong representation. I think it was time well spent. After that, I took a red eye to DC on my own dime and spent the last week on vacation, if you will, driving cross country. So and there were Twitter posts. So those of you tuning in at home can just go look at that if you would like. But no, otherwise there's nothing else to report on my part.
I do have a report.
No, sorry, Sean. I just completely jumped in. Sean,
Board
Member McGuire.
Meeting.
Board Member McGuire, please. Yes.
It's okay. I was teed up for a few good things here, so I can jump off what you guys started. So.
Yeah, it's because Michael segued me into the whole administrative law judge discussion. Okay.
So, Aqua, I would say, was a very enriching experience. I learned what it's like to go to a conference and not actually attend very much of the conference. Just because there were so many folks there to talk to and catch up with. And so that was, I think, time well spent for sure. I saw, a couple of the keynote speeches, including yours, Chair Esquivel, and I thought it was very good. And then I was on a panel for the wetlands and definition and dredger fill procedures. And I was actually better attended than I had expected. There were quite a few folks in the room. It was on the attorney's track, so I was very careful with my words. And I had to preface everything with, I am not an attorney, contrary to everyone else in the room right now. But there's definitely a high level of interest in the guidance that we included that for staff to develop as part. We put it in the resolution when we adopted the policy. So there's a high level of interest in stakeholders engaging in that and what that looks like, how it's going to provide, guidance to the regional boards to have maybe a, consistent understanding of what the policy means and how it's going to be interpreted as we're in this kind of window here, as it's going through OAL approval and then the 9-month kind of delay before the policy takes hold. So I just wanted to mention that as something that was of interest. Then last week,
if I might ask you a question, were there any particular points that they really had, questions around that they were really interested in, you know, the question and answer period, if there was one?
You know, I think there's just ongoing questions about what's in, what's out in terms of waters of the state and, you know, riparian areas. I think maybe the incomplete definition, if I could go there, in terms of waters of the state. I think there's a lot of aspirational hopes about what this guidance might include, so I tried to temper that a little bit in terms of it's really about, you know, the details of what's in here and maybe providing a little more meat on the bone in terms of what was in the policy. So yeah, I'll recap a little bit more for you offline. Yeah. So then last week I went to the Almond Board, not to be confused with the Almond Alliance. And I went to their second annual Navigating the Waters, not to be confused with Dividing the Waters workshop. And that was down in Tulare. And so for me, that was a good opportunity, I think, again, to meet with a lot of the almond growers and kind of hear from them. And a lot of the focus was on Sigma, groundwater sustainability, all of the concerns about them. You know, the reality is hitting home. They talked quite a bit about water markets and things like that. Ellen Hannock was there and talked about the San Joaquin PPIC study. David Guy came and to give a little bit of the Sacramento perspective from NACWA. And then I spoke a little bit about voluntary agreements and the governor's executive order and diversifying, you know, water supply portfolios, just to kind of bring that home. So I thought overall it was a good discussion and time well spent there. And then I did actually go to the thought leaders exercise on safe and reliable drinking water, and so I'm happy to talk with you about that. So one thing I learned was don't call it failing water systems, call it underperforming water systems. Jesse Snyder with Self-Help Enterprises was very clear about that. So that was I would say, a definite takeaway. And for me, I have that ingrained in my brain now. So it's not about systems that are failing, it's about ones that need to improve. They're addressing really difficult and challenging issues with water quality. So I think, you know, it was a good format for a discussion, got a lot of ideas out on the table in a very quick way. We had 2 different breakout groups, and so I had some very challenging questions that we were tasked with answering. I thought I was the engineer, so I was going to be talking about you know, treatment technologies and things, but it was not that. It was about addressing affordability issues and what's Sigma's role in all this and things of that nature. So, but it was a good thought-provoking discussion. But I think we got a lot of ideas on the table, so I'm really interested to see what WRF comes up with in terms of synergizing all those thoughts. But you know, for me, one takeaway is there's still a need, whatever form it may take, for to go back to kind of some regional planning efforts, and you know, not exactly sure what those look like, but you know, we talked about consolidations and knowing where those are versus looking at treatment. And we heard we did have great participation from Division of Drinking Water. Michelle Frederick was there, and DFA Leslie Loudon attended. So we learned quite a bit about you know, SRF contributing funding to projects, and maybe a need for some, you know, value engineering in some cases, because you know, there are instances, I think, where the recommendations that are provided from those systems are not always necessarily the most cost-effective and best recommendations, and so it's a challenging question to answer. And we were just exploring the issues, you know, at that workshop. But I think, you know, there's more to come on that. So it's exciting. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Board Member McGuire. Any other? So our last item here is the Executive Director's report, number 10. Any comment from our Deputy,
it's
Mr. Oppenheimer?
fairly brief and routine report this month, so nothing to highlight unless there's questions.
Okay. No, none from me. None from fellow board members, it seems, either. So I think that's it. 11:45. Got out before noon. Although we didn't have a bio break. We didn't. There was a moment there. I was like, we could have one, but we didn't. And so with that, I was going to ask, nothing on the closed. Okay, no closed session. So this meeting is now adjourned. Thank you, everybody. See you in 2 weeks. Have a great 2 weeks.